Hi everyone. In this class, I'll be discussing increasing and decreasing functions. So we'll be using graphical illustration of increasing and decreasing functions, and also go further to explain a middle cost function that is a stationary function. So let's start with increasing function. Function is increasing at a particular point, let's say point A, if the graph of that function rises as we move from the left to the right within the vicinity of that point. What do I mean by that? Let's say we have this particular graph, okay, and this is the point we are looking at. We want to know whether this function f of x is increasing at this point x equals to a. Okay, so at this point, is this f of x, this function increasing or decreasing? How do we know? We try to check if we move from the left to the right and we observe that the graph is increasing. So we are going to conclude that this function is an increasing function. For example, this is the point we are looking at, x equals to a. Let's move from the left to the right here. So here is our left, this is my left, and this is right. If I move from this left to the right, you will see that this graph is still rising. So because this graph is still rising within the vicinity of this x equal to a, so we say this function is an increasing function. In other words, this graph represents an increasing function. So let's also look at another version of an increasing function. So don't forget what I said earlier, that once we move from the left to the right and we observe that within the vicinity of that particular point, the graph is increasing or the graph is rising, so we say the function is an increasing function. So let's also check this one. Look at this graph, okay? Look at this graph. If you check at this point A, okay, let's move from the left to the right. This is my left, this is the right. If I move from the left to the right, you will observe that this graph is increasing. At this point, x equal to a. So in other words, this graph represents an increasing function. Also, let's move downward. Look at this one. We also have the same thing, but you can see the shape of the graph here. This is a decreasing function. What do you mean by a decreasing function, and how do we identify a decreasing function? So it's the opposite of an increasing function. Don't forget we said if we move from the left to the right within the vicinity of a particular point and you observe that the graph is rising, we say that is an increasing function. But in the case of a decreasing function, it's the exact opposite, like I said. So if you move from the left to the right at a particular point and observe that the graph is falling, okay, so we say this is a decreasing function. Okay, let's take a look at this one. If this is my left, okay, this is my right. If I move from the left to the right, you will see that this graph is falling. Okay, this tells me that this is a decreasing function, because at x equal to a, if I move from the left to the right here, so the graph is falling, so I conclude that this is a decreasing function. Also, look at this another version of a decreasing function. At this point A, if I move from the left to the right, we see that this graph is falling, so this shows that this graph is a decreasing function. Okay. Now let's draw this together. Okay, we can have a graph whereby part of the graph we depict an increasing function part, okay, and the other part we depict uh, a decreasing function, okay. And we can also have a middle course down where the graph will remain constant, so that is a stationary point, okay. Let's take a look at this graph. Look at this from A to B here. This represents an increasing part of this function, increasing part. Because as we move from the left here to the right, we see that this graph is rising. Okay. But if you check the middle here, between B and C, you observe that it's stationary, the thing is constant. So my constant, okay, because it's so constant, this represents the stationary part of this function. If you move to C, now from C to D, we see that as we move from the left to the right, we see that this graph is falling. So that shows that this part represents what the decreasing part of the function. So this is another version of this graph, okay? While this one is another function, what is it called? Another version of this curve, okay? Now, if you look at this one, this part from A, rising from A to B, you will see that as we move from A to B, left to the right, we see it's falling, the graph is falling. It represents a decreasing function. If you look at this, let's say this is C, this is D. From C to D, you will see that the graph is rising. So that is, this part represents a decreasing part of the function. Between B and C, so that represents a stationary part of the function. So in our next class, we are going to depict the same thing using mathematical functions and see when we are given a mathematical function, how do we determine whether the function is decreasing, increasing, or stationary. Stay tuned. See you in the next video. Thank you.